You awaken in a quiet chamber of memory, softly aware of the time. It is late, and outside the window the world is still. You ask yourself, where am I looking from in this moment? Perhaps you are in the faint torch glow of a medieval mortuary hall. And what time is it? It is the hour when the living have folded into sleep, and the dead wait patiently for the rituals designed to carry them home. In the later centuries of the High Middle Ages, European nobility often found themselves far from home when death came on crusade, in distant service, or traveling into hostile lands. They held a firm belief: their body, their bones, must lie at home soil, in a family crypt or ancestral church. In that belief lay the root of a strange and unsettling practice. The custom, known by the Latin name mos Teutonicus, literally the German custom, though used by many European aristocrats beyond German lands, involved reducing the dead body to its bones so that it could be transported without the putrefaction that otherwise would set in during a long journey. Imagine the corpse of a noble knight, felled in distant terrain, his retinue preparing the body under torches. First, the flesh is removed, the organs extracted, the remaining body parts disassembled. Then, marvelously and grotesquely, the bones are boiled in water, wine, or vinegar, until the flesh drifts away and only the clean skeleton remains. This process was practical. Long journeys, especially across the Mediterranean or deserts in crusading campaigns, meant high ambient heat, insects, rot. A decaying corpse en route could become a public hazard and a social embarrassment for a noble family. So the method offered hygiene and dignity in a macabre way. After boiling, the bones would be cleaned, often perfumed or wrapped in cloth, and transported in chests or simple wrappings. The flesh and entrails, once separated, might be buried locally or salted like meat, then shipped separately, or simply interred near the place of death. The skeleton, however, was what carried the identity and lineage of the dead. The belief underlying this was not merely practicality, but theology. Many medieval Christians believed that for the resurrection of the dead at the Last Judgment, the integrity of the bones, the skeletal remains, was essential. If the body decayed, or if the bones were lost, there was anxiety about one's fate. Thus, the bones were prioritized over flesh. Yet this custom carried a tension. It rested at the boundary of ritual respect and unsettling dismemberment. To modern eyes, it is shocking, but in the era it was a cold, accepted fact of noble death. The noble body became cargo. The remains of a man of status were not simply buried where he died, if standards permitted otherwise. The body was processed, boiled, shipped, the bones returned home, the rest left behind. Consider the example of a crusading king who died in foreign lands. For his family to bring him home without risking rot, they might apply this custom. The bones would come home, the flesh would not. For the living, it was a ritual of separation, separating what decays from what lasts. And yet, despite its logic, the practice raised moral and ecclesiastical questions. In the year 1299, the papal decree De Sepulturis by Pope Boniface VIII condemned the custom of cooking and defleshing noble corpses, arguing that the private integrity of the body must be respected for resurrection. Despite the ban, traces of the practice lingered for decades. The inertia of custom, the needs of distant death, and the logistical challenges of burial ensured that the custom did not vanish overnight. Particularly for travelers and nobles who died abroad, the problem remained. From your vantage point now, you imagine candle shadows flickering on the walls of a medieval mortuary crypt. The smell of wine-boiled bones mixes with vinegar and the faint odor of death. The nobles' remains are prepared, wrapped, and sent on a wheeled cart under moonlight. The living look on with a mixture of solemn respect and practical relief, the threat of decay contained, the body dispatched. And still, you wonder, how many noble families followed this custom in the shadows of memory? How many skeletons traveled home while the flesh remained in foreign soil? And what became of those flesh remains, salted or buried, forgotten, far from home, in the dusty camps of crusading armies or the summer heat of Mediterranean ports? Nobles faced not only the threat of battle, but the relentless advance of decay. Flesh, left alone, would swell, stink, attract flies in an age before modern preservation that meant a corpse journeying home might become a public hazard. The custom of skeleton-only transport thus emerged not purely from nobility's vanity, but from very practical logistics of decomposition and travel. In the cold crypts of ancestral churches, the remains of high-born travelers offered continuity of lineage. Arrival of a sealed bone chest from abroad was an event. Burial ceremonies would treat the bones with pageantry, emphasizing the return of identity even while the flesh was long gone. For the living family, it reinforced ties to the deceased and land. Yet with this custom came the peculiar tension, the body honored, but also dismembered. The entrails might be dumped locally, the flesh salted or buried elsewhere, the bones transported. In some records, the flesh was treated almost as cargo waste, distant from the honor reserved for the skeleton. The nobility accepted this as part of their mortality in a mobile age. Consider the setting: a monk in a camp chapel, the torchlight flickering over a corpse. The monk reads prayers while assistants begin to remove organs. Nearby, the boiling vat steams, water, wine, or vinegar bubbling, the flesh loosening from the bones. Each scrape of the bone is ritual, each slice of tissue a necessary step in honoring a noble's wish to rest at home. The belief system behind this was as much theological as practical. Many in the period believed the bones had to remain intact for resurrection at the Last Judgment. The decaying flesh, by contrast, was seen as tied to corruption and sin. Thus, cleaning the bones, separating them from rotting tissue, became a symbolic act of spiritual purification. Records show that this custom was especially common among German aristocrats, but not exclusively so. Its Latin name, Mos Teutonicus, literally means the German custom. It was used by kings and nobles of various lands when they died abroad. The term helps us understand how foreign the practice seemed even then. Not every culture accepted it. While nobles traveled with their retinues and banners, the journey home of the dead was often less glorious. A cart loaded with a chest of bones headed toward homeland, guarded by retainers, passing through inns and villages. In those inns, local folk might hear of the journey, smell the vinegar, see the somber procession, and wonder at the strange cargo. Not a body, but bones. Despite the appearance of order, the process was risky and sometimes gruesome. Boiling flesh, lingering scent, insects attracted. The very image of death was intensified by the procedures. Yet the custom endured, because for nobles it was a compromise between honorable burial and geographical reality. The Church eventually intervened. In 1299 to 1300, the papal bull De Sepulturis, issued by Pope Boniface VIII, condemned the practice of boiling and dismembering corpses for transport, raising theological concerns about bodily integrity. However, the bull did not immediately eliminate the practice. Old habits and remote deaths kept it alive for decades. For historians today, the bone chests and cut-marked skeletons found in graves speak of the custom's reach. Osteoarchaeological research shows that some nobles' bones bear clear signs of defleshing and boiling, a silent testament beneath the soil. The very transitions from flesh to bone tell a story of death, distance, and duty. So now, lying here in your mind's eye, you observe the final moments in which the flesh parts ways with the bones. You feel the hush of the crypt, the echo of the cart's wheels on cobbled roads, the weight of the chest containing the remains, and you sense the unresolved question: what must it have felt like for the noble whose body lay torn, boiled, reconstructed for home soil, and for the family who awaited only the bones? In the archives of princely houses you find directives. If the Lord dies beyond the Rhine, the body shall be prepared by trusted surgeons or monks, the flesh removed by boiling the bones to be returned to the ancestral crypt. This prescriptive language shows how deeply the custom of Mos Teutonicus had entered noble logistic planning, not mere improvisation, but a recognized procedure. The burden of preserving status after death weighed heavily on the aristocrat. If a noble died in the Holy Land or in Iberia, his family might still wish his body laid among his forebears. But the Mediterranean climate, the delay in transport, the risk of rotting flesh, all these made full-body burial difficult. Hence, the bones became the symbol of identity and continuity, easier to move, carry, and inter with dignity. The very act of dismemberment and boiling was, for the living, a balancing act between respect and necessity. On one hand, the body was still honored. On the other, it was treated as logistical cargo. Monks or specialized mortuary workers would oversee the process. Wine or vinegar in the cauldron. Boiling hours pass, flesh loosens, bones scrubbed. The smell, the steam, everyday medieval mortuary reality. Some nobles preferred alternative methods. Embalming or heart burial, where the heart or entrails were removed and buried locally and the body elsewhere. But in regions where rotting was rapid or transport slow, Mos Teutonicus offered a practical compromise. It was cheaper than full embalming, more hygienic for travel, and stilled the worry of leaving the body behind. Archaeologists looking at noble tombs have found cut marks on bones, evidence of disarticulation and boiling. These silent incisions speak to the hidden ritual that once stood behind polished marble tombs. The remains of highborn who died abroad were altered, not left whole, and their bones tell that story centuries later. In some cases, the bones were not simply returned, but accompanied by charters, seals, and heraldic emblems. The final rites performed in the homeland church. A procession might bring the box of cleaned bones into the crypt. The monk reciting prayers, incense rising, the family collecting around. The flesh remains, entrails, organs, sometimes salted flesh, might lie elsewhere. The division of body becomes a division of honor. One striking case, a king dying during a crusade, his nobles arranging for his body's bones to travel home. The flesh sacrificed to distance and decay. The homeland receives the bones. The family honors the lineage. The king's identity preserved, though separated from his body. Such practices challenge the modern idea of an intact burial as the only honorable way. The Church's objection to the practice was rooted in theology. The integrity of the body was linked with the promise of resurrection. Orderly dismemberment and boiling disturbed some clerics' sense of respect for the dead. In 1297 to 1299, the papal bull, De Sepulchris, by Pope Boniface VIII, sought to forbid the custom. But enforcement was patchy, and far-flung nobles dying abroad often fell outside immediate ecclesiastical control. As you imagine yourself in a cold crypt, you sense the dual reality. On one hand, the desire to preserve dignity and lineage. On the other, the grim logistics of death in a pre-modern world. The noble's body lies across seas. The bones travel. The flesh is abandoned. The custom embodies a world where death, travel, identity, and honor were intimately entangled. The question that remains: what happened when a noble died in such remote lands that even the bones could not return? As you lie back and drift deeper into the dim hours of your mind, imagine the map of medieval Europe. A noble falls ill or is struck down in the Levant or North Africa. His body lies in a tent or makeshift chapel, while his retainers face a harsh decision: either bury him where he died, abandoning the ancestral tombs, or attempt the journey home through seas and mountains. In many cases, the travel was too slow for an intact corpse. The heat and smells too great a risk. Thus the decision was made: reduce the body, retain the bones, send them home. The logistics were substantial: a chest strong enough to carry human bones, a team of trusted mortuary workers or monks, a cart, sometimes a ship. Delays were constant: weather, piracy, war. In some documented cases, bones traveled months or even years before arrival. Meanwhile, flesh and entrails were locally interred or salted for preservation. The bones were what arrived at the homeland church, what the family attended to in ritual. For the common folk of the era, this custom must have seemed strange and perhaps horrifying. To them, death meant the body decaying in the earth where it fell. To the noble, it meant a second journey after death. And you, as listener, feel the contrast: the peasant grave in autumn clay, the noble's bones wrapped and forwarded across Europe. One body, two very different fates. In some cases, the process left tangible traces. Archaeologists have discovered skeletons with cut marks on long bones, signs of ligatures, evidence of boiling or defleshing, long after death. Those traces speak less of ritual glorification than of mortuary engineering, practical, logistical, grimly efficient. The theological debate was real. To some churchmen, the mutilation of the body risked interfering with the soul's resurrection. A skeleton stripped of flesh, a body dismembered. These were not merely practical matters, but spiritual concerns. Thus, Pope Boniface VIII, in his Bull de Sepulchris of 1297–99, explicitly banned the practice of dismemberment and boiling for transportation. Yet the custom continued for decades afterward. Remote travelers, crusading nobles, children of foreign courts, they still required home burial. In regions where embalming was unknown or impractical, this method remained the lesser evil. It survived not because it was loved, but because the alternatives were worse. You sense the midnight silence of the crypt in the homeland. The chest of bones arrives. The funeral choir chants. Incense rises. The flesh that once bore the living form of the noble is forgotten abroad. Only the skeleton is honored. Yet you feel the unanswered question resting in the hush. If the flesh stayed behind, separated from the honored skeleton, what did that say about that person's identity, completeness, dignity? And now you ponder the broader meaning. This custom reveals a time when death was mobile, the body negotiable, lineage portable. The bones symbolized continuity and honor. The flesh symbolized what decays, what cannot travel. The custom speaks of power, distance, mortality. It invites reflection. In our modern age, we demand intact funerals, but for them, the intact funeral may have been impossible. In the hush of your mind, you wonder, how many nobles, in the span of those centuries, never reached their ancestral tomb, even as their bones did? How many processions wept for skeletal remains? And how many commoners heard of the German custom and whispered their own silent disbelief at the sight of a chest of bones rolling through the village at dawn? Even more obscure is how the custom of skeletal transport intersected with relic culture. Some nobles insisted that their bones, once returned, be displayed in ossuaries or crypt niches as relics of family lineage, not unlike saints' bones in monastic displays. In doing so, the bones of a deceased noble became a visible symbol of continuity, power, and inheritance for future generations. For example, when a noble's bones reached home soil, the family might commission a special stone chest or ornate reliquary to house them, sometimes inscribed with heraldic motifs and prayers for the deceased's soul. The journey of the bones thus became part of the narrative of the family's prestige. Absence of flesh meant absence of decay, enabling the family to uphold honor across distance and time. Meanwhile, the ignored flesh and entrails posed a different story. Often buried where the death occurred or salted for later disposal, these remains were seldom valued or memorialized. In many instances, the entrails were regarded as ignoble and left in haste, while the skeleton received ceremonial reverence. This bifurcation of body parts challenges our modern ideas of sanctity and wholeness. In far-off lands, such as during crusades or in military campaigns, the procedure could be carried out under less than ideal conditions. Wet ship decks, limited monk mortal workers, heat and insect infestational conspired to make timely transport of a full body impossible. Thus, the method of reducing a corpse to bones for safe passage was as much survival as dignity. What is seldom told is that the practice left an archival trail of expense accounts, payments for vats of vinegar, sacks of salt, linen wrappings, carts, and guards for the bongest. These logistics, often recorded in noble household ledgers, reveal how death and transport were integrated into the operations of noble estates and campaigns. The cost of preserving honor after death was real. Archaeological research now shows that in several Central European royal tombs, the long bones of medieval nobles bear telltale cut marks and polishing consistent with boiling and cleaning. These physical traces corroborate the written sources and remind us that the German custom was not abstract. it left real, visible marks, a particularly chilling truth. In some cases, the bones were distributed across multiple burial sites. A monarch's heart might be buried in one cathedral, the entrails in another, and the cleaned skeleton in a third. This fragmentation of the body served both logistical and symbolic ends, reminding us of how mobile and divisible identity could become in late medieval aristocracy. You, the listener, may picture a family crypt echoing with footsteps as procession banners wave. The chest of bones is placed on a bier. Incense rises. Yet you also glimpse the silent field abroad, where the salts were poured, the organs buried. The two locations are part of the same death journey, yet worlds apart in ritual and remembrance. And now you are left with the question: when the skeletal remains of a noble arrived home, did the absence of flesh ever matter to the living? Did the family feel incomplete? Did the departed sense indignity in being reduced? Or did the noble accept the bones-only burial as the price of returning home? You lie back now as the story continues. The chest of bones has arrived home. But the journey is far from complete, for ritual, memory, and theology must all reconcile the strange fate of that body. The bones rest in a crypt, the flesh forgotten abroad, and the living watch and wait. As time passed in the late 13th century, the procedure of boiling, reducing, and transporting noble remains became not just a logistical workaround, but a ritual in its own right. The aristocrat's death far from home no longer meant abandonment. Instead, a new choreography emerged: dismember, purify, transport, entomb. What the journey accomplished, it also ritualized. The bones became the honored element, the flesh the practical casualty of distance. The very ceremonies around returning remains took on heightened meaning among noble houses. Yet the ecclesiastical authorities began to bristle at what they perceived as a challenge to Christian doctrine. The body was more than flesh, and bone it was a vessel of the soul, destined for resurrection. The severing of flesh from bone, the removal of organs, the shipping of skeletal remains, these seemed to many clerics a breach of divine order. In 1299, a papal decree formally condemned such practices. While the decree did not end the custom overnight, it signaled a turning tide. The old ritual was now uneasy, haunted by church suspicion. In the noble courts, the reaction was nuanced. Some retreated from the full method of boiled remains and adopted alternatives: heart burial, entrail burial, selective transport. The custom evolved. A noble might now stipulate in his will, "Let my heart be buried in the mother church. Let my bones come home, but spare my flesh the journey." These modifications show how the custom adapted, neither abandoned entirely nor practiced without change. Behind the scenes, the cost and practical burden remained heavy: transporting bones securely, preparing the washing or boiling vats, hiring mortuary workers at distant sites, paying for embalming or salting when necessary. Archives show ledgers listing vats full of vinegar or wine used to boil remains, payments to monks for prayers, carts for bone chests. For the family, the expectation of a home burial leveled into a logistical undertaking worthy of its own budget. Even more subtle was how society at large perceived the custom. For the common folk, burial meant leaving the body where it died, or simply burying it locally with minimal ceremony. But for nobles, death meant journeying, even beyond the grave. Rumors circulated in villages. The count's bones passed our inn at midnight, wrapped in cloth, no flesh in sight. Such tales filled the twilight hours, mixing reverence, curiosity, and discomfort. The dead were returning, but in pieces. Archaeologists later unearthed skeletons bearing cuts and polish consistent with boiling and cleaning, verifying what textual sources hinted. These physical traces speak silently of the custom's reach, of parts moved, of bodies partially honored, of identity sorted into containers and carted across borders. The proof lies in the bone. Long after the ritual ended, the marks remained. And yet the theological question lingered. If a noble's bones returned home, but his flesh remained in foreign soil, was he still whole in death? Did his family feel his presence complete? Did the church regard his burial as legitimate? For many families, the ritual achieved its purpose. The bones lay in the ancestral crypt, but for the soul, for memory, questions remained. Now you drift in half-sleep, pondering this thought, when the bones rest among ancestors, but the flesh lies in distant ground. Which place does the noble truly inhabit? And how does the living reconcile honor for one part of the body, while the other lies forgotten? You watch now as the ritual of returning the bones unfolds into a web of power, prestige, and uneasy morality. The noble's journey has begun in death, but the ripple effects stretch far beyond. In the castles and courts of Europe, the arrival of a chest containing only bones could become a showcase of status. The noble's peers gathered. The heralds announced the arrival. Banners flew. What was being buried was not merely a man, but a lineage. The bones thus played a dual role, relics of personal memory and symbols of dynastic continuity. The fact that they had traveled thousands of miles, boiled, cleaned, wrapped-hatted, the logistics became part of the message. We moved death so my ancestor may rest here. At the same time, the church watched with mixed concern. On one hand, the transport and burial of bones allowed the dead to lie in consecrated ground, which was favorable. On the other hand, the process of dismemberment, boiling, sediment of flesh and organs separated away, conflicted with theological ideals of bodily integrity. The tension surfaced in sermons. Priests reminded the living, the body, flesh, and bone must rise in the last judgment. What room was there for a body stripped of flesh, its parts scattered or processed? Where was dignity in a skeleton borne in a cart rather than laid in tomb? Yet the noble houses adapted. Some turned to selective customs. Hearts interred in homeland cathedrals, entrails in foreign chapels, bones packaged for return. The practice morphed. No longer simply full-body transits, but fragmented burials matching the new realities of travel, war, distance, and allegiance. A noble might die on crusade, his heart sent home immediately by courier, his bones by ship months later, his flesh perhaps buried locally with a small chapel service. The parts of the body corresponded to parts of identity: heart for devotion, body for lineage, bones for heritage. The cost of such undertakings is seldom recorded in dramatic words, but the ledgers show it. Entry for cart, hire for bone chest, guard for route from port, salt and vinegar for body reduction, wrapping cloth for skeleton. These mundane entries sit beside horses for crusade and castle repairs. They remind us that death, even among the highest, was also accounting. The honor of burial had its invoice. Traveling nobles who died far away forced their families into making decisions not only of mourning, but of budget and transport. In village inns along the hall of returning remains, common folk heard the rumor and saw the odd sight: carts labeled with noble crests carrying locked chests rather than coffins. At night, some claimed they smelled vinegar or wine steeping in the air, as though the process left an aura behind. Letters exchanged between court clerks mention the returning chest of Count X and note quietly, with skeleton only. The custom left its footprint not just in grand tombs, but in the whispered margins of everyday life. Archaeology adds even more subtle revelations. In Central Europe, skeletons excavated from noble crypts show polished surfaces, cut marks consistent with boiling, and sometimes missing elements such as vertebrae or ribs, perhaps repurposed or lost in transport. These bones tell a story the documents only hint at. The noble did not arrive intact. His identity, once embodied in flesh and presence, arrived in fragments, bones, cleaned, sanctified, interred. For the family, the box was home. For the body, the journey had changed him. Yet, the Church's prohibition did gradually shift the practice. The decree issued by Pope Boniface VIII in 1299 aimed to forbid the practice of body dismemberment and boiling for transport. But in remote lands, in times of war, the engines of aristocratic prestige and logistics outpaced canon law. Some nobles died in regions where the Church's reach was tenuous. The custom lingered for decades, blending into other burial forms, but its momentum had slowed. The ethical question remained, and slowly burial customs changed. And as you drift in the quiet of your mind, you might ask, what of the noble whose bones traveled home, whose flesh did not? Did his soul know the difference? And what of the families who accepted the box of bones as their ancestor, but could never see the body whole? As centuries turned, the line between faith and flesh began to blur. The medieval world was obsessed not only with life after death, but with how the transition occurred. A body's decay was not seen merely as rot. It was theology in motion. How fast one decomposed, how sweet or foul the smell, how preserved the bones remained. All these became moral indicators. To the medieval mind, corruption of the body might signal corruption of the soul. Thus, even the most gruesome customs, boiling, evisceration, or partial burial, were often justified not by cruelty, but by salvation. The logic was circular, but deeply believed. By purifying the body, they were also purifying sin. Monks spoke of the body returning to its elements, as if decomposition itself was a sacred act. To interfere with that process by embalming or cutting was risky. Yet to leave a noble's corpse rotting on foreign soil was unthinkable. Out of that moral tension grew compromise. Let the flesh decay elsewhere, but let the bones, the purest part, turn home. In monastic chronicles from France, Germany, and the Low Countries, one finds accounts of transit burials, temporary graves, where travelers or soldiers were laid to decompose before their bones were retrieved months later. The process was both natural and deliberate. The monks tended the site, sometimes sprinkling quicklime to hasten decay. Once the flesh was gone, the bones were washed, dried, and wrapped in linen. This was the sanitized version of death's journey, still macabre, but framed in the language of care. The boiling method, known as mos Teutonicus, was far more direct. It stripped the body of corruption within hours. Cauldrons of wine, vinegar, or even lye were used to reduce flesh from bone. The smell, acrid, fatty, unforgettable, was said to linger in the monasteries that performed the act. But efficiency triumphed over delicacy. Armies on campaign had no time for natural decay. They needed remains ready to travel before disease could spread. You can almost imagine the scene now, drifting in that candlelit medieval chamber. Monks in brown habits lowering a noble's body into a steaming vat, murmuring prayers to steady their souls. Outside, the night wind rattles against the monastery shutters. Death here is both work and worship. When the bones are lifted out, gleaming pale in torchlight, they are not seen as desecrated but redeemed. Even so, whispers spread through Christendom. Some priests denounced the practice as barbaric mimicry of pagan rites. Others defended it as necessity born from faith. Chroniclers wrote in half apology. One described it as the cruelest mercy, the mercy of return. The controversy deepened when royal figures began to request such treatment explicitly in their wills. Crusading kings and nobles who knew they would die far from home often specified that their bodies be processed for transport. One famous case was Louis IX of France, who died in Tunisia during the Eighth Crusade in 1270. His flesh was boiled away, and his bones returned triumphantly to Paris. The process, though pious in intent, scandalized many clerics, but among nobles it became a mark of devotion. Even in death, one could serve both God and homeland. Over time, the meaning of the practice shifted again. What began as practicality became ritualized display. The noble who returned home as bones was paraded through towns, his casket draped in silks, his relics kissed by mourners. Death had become theater, merging of mourning and spectacle. In a world where pilgrimage, relics, and bodily remains held sacred power, the noble's bones blurred the line between saint and sinner. Yet beneath the ceremony, a quiet unease persisted. The peasants who glimpsed the bone chests often muttered of curses. They feared that tampering with the dead invited misfortune. Local superstition mixed with Christian dread, producing a haunting contradiction. Veneration and revulsion intertwined. The same bones that symbolized honor for the noble could symbolize pollution to the commoner. The late medieval shift towards stricter burial law was, in part, a reaction to these anxieties. Church councils decreed that each man should rest where he died. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and habit dies slower than flesh. In some corners of Europe, Bohemia, Saxony, the Rhineland, the practice lingered quietly into the 15th century, hidden behind euphemisms like transport of relics. Families who could afford it continued to bring their ancestors home, regardless of papal opinion. As the centuries rolled on, what had once been necessity became embarrassment. Later generations avoided mentioning the vats, the boiling, the dividing. Chronicles softened their language. His bones were brought home with honor. They would write, leaving unsaid the smoke, the smell, the flesh reduced to broth. Now, as you drift further into that meditative half-sleep, imagine the ghost of that custom, still whispering through Europe's cathedrals, the bones of the dead lying beneath ornate floors, their journeys erased from inscription. What stories might those silent bones tell, if they could recall the heat that stripped them clean, the carts that carried them home, the prayers said over their empty flesh? And you might wonder, was this truly devotional denial of decay itself? Did they seek to honor the dead, or to erase the reality of death? By the late 13th century, death in Europe had become not just a spiritual passage, but an industry. Behind the rituals of mourning were tradesmen, monks, scribes, and merchants who profited quietly from grief. There were the men who carved coffins, those who prepared embalming herbs, the women who spun linen for shrouds, and the cartmasters who ferried remains from port to castle. Each death rippled outward through an invisible economy. The bone trade, as chroniclers later called it, was not a formal commerce, but its movement resembled one. Monastic orders on travel routes often specialized in the preparation of noble remains. A messenger from a distant battlefield might arrive at an abbey bearing a sealed letter and a wrapped body, requesting Mos Teutonicus to be performed. The monks would accept it in silence. They boiled, cleaned, wrapped, prayed, and finally crated the bones for their journey home. Payment was left discreetly on the altar. It is strange to imagine today that in these quiet monasteries built for prayer and peace, there once simmered vats large enough to hold a man. The smoke of rendered flesh mixed with incense, the sound of chanting overlaying the hiss of boiling liquid. For the monks, it was labor that tested faith, to reduce a fellow Christian to his purest elements while praying for his soul's ascent. Few spoke of it afterward. In England, the Chronicles of the Grey Friars hint at another dimension, the emergence of portable sanctity. Bones were not only family relics, they became semi-sacred objects. When a noble's skeleton returned, it might be interred beneath the family chapel, and pilgrims, often relatives or retainers, would come to touch the stone, as if the bones within held protective power. In some cases, finger bones or teeth were quietly removed before burial, kept as talismans of loyalty. The practice blurred into the veneration of saints. Just as the Church displayed the bones of holy figures in gilded reliquaries, noble families began to create smaller domestic shrines. The distinction between holiness and heritage thinned. A saint's finger and an ancestor's rib occupied similar glass cases, both reminders of continuity, both stripped of flesh, both uncomfortably beautiful. But alongside devotion came an undercurrent of unease. Physicians of the later Middle Ages, steeped in humoral theory, began to question whether interfering with decay might upset the natural order. The body, they taught, was a delicate balance of elements: earth, air, fire, and water. To halt or hasten its corruption could disturb not only the corpse, but the cosmos. Some even warned that improperly treated remains could cause disease by releasing miasmith, the invisible vapor of death. As trade and travel increased, such fears spread. Ports in Venice and Genoa sometimes refused ships carrying processed remains, fearing contamination. In response, families disguised the transport as relic shipments. A noble's skeleton might arrive in Europe, marked reliquiae sanctae, blessed cargo, exempt from inspection. Thus the pious disguise preserved both dignity and secrecy. Meanwhile, chroniclers recorded smaller, quieter story servants who carried a single bone across mountains. widows who waited years for their husband's return in skeletal form, knights who buried comrades on foreign soil, knowing the families would later dig them up. Death in the Middle Ages was never still. It was itinerant, migratory, always moving between continents and consciences. There is something hypnotic about that motion. Even now, in candlelight, you can almost hear the creak of the cartwheels, the shuffle of monks at dawn, the distant toll of a bell marking another departure. The medieval world did not hide from death. It lived with it, smelled it, handled it daily. And yet, through all this familiarity, it feared, above all, the wrong kind of death, one that left the body incomplete or far from home. By the dawn of the 14th century, these anxieties had become encoded in law. Local councils debated the right of a man to be buried on ancestral soil. Some towns introduced permits for the transport of remains. Others banned it outright. The papal edicts against dismemberment were read aloud in cathedrals. But in practice, the edicts were treated like the bones themselves, cleaned, rewrapped, and quietly carried past inspection. To modern ears, these customs sound grotesque, yet within them lay a profound yearning for order in a chaotic world. War, plague, and pilgrimage scattered bodies. The act of bringing bones home was less about vanity than about reclaiming meaning. To retrieve the skeleton was to stitch together the torn map of family, faith, and identity. And so the cauldrons kept boiling, the monks kept chanting, and Europe kept dreaming of wholeness through dismemberment. Now, as you drift deeper into the quiet rhythm of this story, picture those bones resting beneath stone floors that tourists walk over today. Cathedrals, castles, abbeys, they are still there, silent witnesses to a time when cleanliness and sanctity were measured not by soap or prayer, but by how efficiently one could strip the flesh from bone. The medieval world tried, in its own way, to conquer decay, but decay, as always, conquered back. You can almost feel the air changing now, the smoke from the old boiling vats thinning, the bells of monasteries tolling softer. The Europe of the 14th century was not the same world that had birthed Mos Teutonicus. The age of crusading nobles had waned, and new fears had taken their place. Plague had come, not the private decay of one nobleman, but the mass, unstoppable corruption of entire cities. In the face of the Black Death, the medieval fascination with bodily purity suddenly felt trivial. Flesh itself was suspect. Breath was poison. Even prayer could not purify the air. And so, for the first time, the focus of burial shifted from the journey of one body to the survival of the many. Cities began digging communal pits instead of crypts. The notion of transporting remains across borders seemed almost absurd when thousands died at once. Where once monks boiled one knight's flesh to carry home his bones, now they shoveled hundreds into trenches, covering them quickly before contagion spread. Death had grown too large to be and yet, amid this horror, something subtle changed. The sight of so many unburied dead made people see the body differently. It was no longer an object of pride or possession, but of humility. Dust returning to dust, the medieval dream of preservation gave way to the whispered acceptance. When the plague finally ebbed, Europe's relationship with death had matured, though scarred. The surviving church officials renewed their bans on dismemberment. New burial codes demanded whole-body interment, sanctified ground, and clear separation between sacred and profane handling of remains. Slowly, the bone-boiling monks faded into memory. But habits die slowly, like embers beneath ash. In remote regions of the Alps and Rhineland, small abbeys still practiced modified versions of the rite: partial burials, skeleton cleanings, heart extractions. The church looked away, preferring not to reignite old disputes. In truth, even as the ritual was condemned, its logic remained persuasive. Home mattered, place mattered, lineage mattered. By the 15th century, embalming had replaced boiling. Alchemists and apothecaries began mixing preservative balms of resin, myrrh, and wine. They promised not salvation, but delay the illusion of timeless sleep. Nobles who once sent home their bones now sent their whole bodies, embalmed, perfumed, sealed in lead coffins. The horror of flesh transformed into the gentler horror of stillness. The world grew quieter, cleaner, more orderly. But beneath the polished stone of Renaissance tombs lay the same old fear, the fear of rotting alone. Even the rise of science could not fully dispel it. Anatomists, once forbidden to touch the dead, began dissecting corpses for study. The same process that had horrified priests 2 centuries earlier became the foundation of medicine. The boiled bones of crusaders gave way to the cleaned skeletons of medical theaters. Death was still being reduced, studied, and transported, only now in the name of knowledge rather than faith. When you look at the preserved skeleton in a museum today, bones white as chalk, joints wired, skull grinning under glass, you are seeing a distant echo of that medieval custom. The idea that bones could speak, that they could travel, that they could stand for the person once alive, that belief never truly left us. It only changed its language. As Europe entered the modern age, chroniclers softened the memory of Mos Teutonicus. They spoke not of boiling, but of the honorable translation of remains. The phrase covered centuries of discomfort. Families still wanted their ancestors close, even if the means had changed. A nobleman's bones might be moved from an old monastery to a new mausoleum. A queen's heart might still lie in a chapel apart from her body. The ritual was cleaner now, but its soul remained intact. Bring the beloved home. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered bone chests in cathedrals and abbeys, they found faint traces of this forgotten world: knife marks on ribs, heat-polished femurs, residue of wine and vinegar. These were not just scientific clues. They were the fingerprints of faith and fear intertwined. And perhaps that is the quiet truth the Middle Ages left behind. For all their superstition and cruelty, they looked at the body and saw something both sacred and fragile. They feared decay, not because it was ugly, but because it was proof that life, even noble life, ends. Now, as you breathe slowly, imagine standing in one of those old cathedrals. Beneath your feet lie centuries of bones, crusaders, monks, queens, servants, all reduced to the same pale dust. Some were boiled, some embalmed, some forgotten where they fell. The marble is cool, the candles flicker. Outside, night rain taps against stained glass. The world has changed, but death has not. The custom of dismemberment faded into legend, but its whisper lingers wherever we still struggle to keep the dead near in the photographs we keep, the urns we guard, the monuments we build. Every generation, in its own way, tries to make death less distant. The question lingers in the air like incense. Were they truly so different from us? The answer, if you listen long enough, seems to whisper through the stones themselves. For the Middle Ages never really ended. They simply sank beneath the skin of our modern world. Even after Teutonicus was outlawed, its shadow remained in the ways people treated the dead. In the centuries that followed, across Europe, families began collecting not flesh or bone, but hair. Locks of the deceased, braided and preserved in pendants, rings, or tiny glass reliquaries. In some towns, widows would keep these curls beneath their pillows, whispering to them as if to the living. The gesture was gentler than boiling, but the meaning was the same, to hold on to something that should have been let go. In old abbeys of France, monks continued to carve ossuaries into the earth, underground chambers lined with skulls and femurs stacked like books. They said it was practical, a way to save space in crowded graveyards. But in truth, it was reverence disguised as efficiency. Each bone was a page in the long history of mankind's refusal to forget. The 17th century brought with it the illusion of reason, the Enlightenment. Yet, even as philosophers debated the soul, kings still demanded that their hearts be buried separately. The heart of King Richard I, for instance, was found centuries later, embalmed and wrapped in linen, buried beneath the floor of Rouen Cathedral. The medieval idea of dividing the body had survived beneath the rational age's powdered wigs. Science had not erased faith, it had simply dressed it in finer clothes. But even more haunting was what began in the age of exploration. When European sailors crossed oceans and conquered new lands, they brought with them not just weapons and crosses, but relics, the preserved remains of saints, bones sealed in silver, fragments of skulls carried across seas. These holy remains were used to claim divine right over foreign soil. In that sense, the medieval obsession with transporting bones lived on only now. It was not about bringing the dead home, but about bringing holiness outward to new worlds. And so, the ritual evolved once again, the corpse as symbol, the bone as power, the relic as flag. By the 18th and 19th centuries, when archaeology emerged as a discipline, the tables turned entirely. Where monks once boiled flesh in secrecy, now scientists unearthed bones in daylight. Cathedrals that had hidden skulls behind altars now watched as universities displayed them in cabinets. The sacred had become the studied, but the fascination, that deep, unshakable curiosity about what remains, had never left. It was as if the Middle Ages had planted a seed in the collective mind of humanity, the need to see the bones, to look at what lies beneath. And isn't that what we still do? When we dig, when we preserve, when we remember. The sleeping tone of history tells us this. Every civilization has tried to control the decay of flesh. Egyptians wrapped it, Romans burned it, medieval Christians boiled it, and modern science freezes it. The methods differ, the fear does not. As centuries passed, Europe's fascination with bodily remains took new shapes. The Victorians, in their obsession with mourning, built entire industries around death: black attire, mourning jewelry, post-mortem photography. Mothers posed with their dead infants, their eyes forced open by the photographer's hand, the last desperate echo of keeping the dead close. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the faint simmer of that medieval cauldron disguised beneath lace and velvet. In some remote monasteries, old manuscripts still bear marginal notes written by trembling monks. They recorded the rites of dismemberment not with pride, but with guilt, as if ashamed of what necessity had made them do. Better to sin with knife and flame, one wrote, than let the body rot. That line alone captures the medieval mind, a mixture of faith, love, and terror that modern people can barely understand. And perhaps that is the real horror, not the boiling of flesh, but the tenderness behind it. A father who wanted his son's bones to rest beside his own. A knight who feared dying on foreign soil, far from his ancestors. Behind the grotesque ritual was something heartbreakingly human, the refusal to accept separation. Now, when historians handle those ancient skeletons, they see burn marks and think of ritual. But if you were to listen, really listen, to the silence around those bones, you might hear something softer. Not cruelty, not barbarism, but longing. The longing of a world that believed fiercely, desperately, that death could be tamed through care, that if the body was treated properly, the soul would find peace. And even now, as you lie listening centuries away, that longing has not died. We still embalm, we still cremate, we still build memorials and whisper prayers. We still carry ashes in lockets, just as they once carried bones in chests. The forms have changed, but the ache beneath them remains unchanged, to not be forgotten. If you ever find yourself walking through an old cathedral, pause and look at the stone beneath your feet. The names may have faded, the bones long turned to dust, but their presence is there, humming beneath the marble. The Middle Ages never truly vanished. They sleep beneath us, their stories pressed between the stones, like breath between pages. And somewhere in the deep quiet of the earth, the last echoes of most Teutonicus still stir, a faint memory of hands washing bones, of smoke rising under moonlight, of people trying, in their own strange way, to make peace with the impermanence of flesh. So, as the candles burn low and the night deepens, remember this: the most disgusting customs of the Middle Ages were not born from cruelty, but from love, the desperate, fearful kind of love that cannot bear to let go. And perhaps, after all this time, we are not so different. We've just learned to hide our fear behind prettier rituals, softer words, and polished marble. But the heart of it, the trembling wish to bring the dead home, still beats quietly in us all. You may think that such grotesque customs belong to another world entirely, a world of torches and superstition, of monasteries and mud. But the truth is softer, stranger. The Middle Ages never truly left us. Their customs merely changed their clothes. The same hands that once boiled flesh now wear surgical gloves. The same fear of decay that sent knights' corpses into cauldrons now drives the cold hum of the mortuary freezer. Technology has replaced fire, but the purpose is the same: to delay time, to resist the inevitable. If you walk into a modern embalming room, the stainless steel tables glint under sterile light. The air smells faintly of formaldehyde, sharp, clean, yet strangely hollow. There is no chanting, no prayer, no priest, and yet the act is nearly identical to to what was once done under the shadow of monastery walls. Flesh is treated, fluids replaced, color restored, the illusion of life maintained for just a little longer. The Middle Ages, for all their horror, were honest about what they were doing. We, perhaps, have simply made it prettier. In laboratories across the world, another echo hums quietly, the quest to preserve not only the body, but the mind. Cryonics, the freezing of human remains in liquid nitrogen, is perhaps the ultimate expression of mos Teutonicus. It is not boiling but freezing, not separation by knife but by time. The goal is the same, to bridge the distance between death and return, to be preserved until home or history calls again. In museums, too, the medieval impulse lives on, behind glass cases, illuminated by soft yellow light, lie bones and relics, saints' fingers, fragments of skulls, bits of hair sealed in amber resin. Visitors lean close, whispering as if afraid to disturb the stillness. Some of these relics were stolen centuries ago, traded like jewels or trophies. Others were excavated in the name of science. But whether holy or historical, they are all held with the same reverence, the desire to keep. It is a strange irony. We once boiled our dead to honor them. Now we display them to understand them. Both acts, in their way, are forms of devotion. Even the modern cemetery, peaceful, trimmed, lined with marble, carries a trace of medieval anxiety. The obsession with order, with naming, with permanence, is centuries old. The gravestone is simply the medieval tomb reimagined in stone and grass. Beneath its surface, we are still medieval souls, tracing the same longing for connection across time. Consider to the rituals of the state, those grand, televised funerals that halt entire nations. When a great figure dies, the medieval kings would have understood perfectly. The slow procession, the veiled faces, the tolling bells, these are not modern inventions. They are inherited gestures, passed down through the centuries, like relics themselves. The British royal family, for instance, still practices a ritual called the lying in state, where the deceased monarch's body is displayed for days, guarded by ceremonial soldiers. The velvet, the candles, the silence, all are echoes of the medieval vigil of the dead. We watch, we mourn, we pass by, whispering as though we stand in a cathedral. And somewhere, faintly, the old fear stirs again. What if the soul lingers nearby, waiting to see how we treat its shell? The more you look, the more the pattern reveals itself. In hospitals, bodies are wheeled quietly down hidden corridors, away from the eyes of the living. In universities, cadavers are dissected and studied, their remains later buried or cremated with care. We have turned death into a system, yet even within that system, the medieval heart beats, respect, ritual, restraint. Perhaps the most haunting continuation of those customs lies not on Earth, but in the stars. When astronauts die in space, and yes, some have, their remains cannot always return home. NASA has quietly considered burial options beyond Earth's atmosphere: cremation, ejection, preservation. It is an ancient problem in a modern setting, the same one faced by knights who fell far from home. The cosmos has become our new holy land, and once again, humanity must ask, how do we bring our dead home when home is beyond reach? In this way, every era faces the same dilemma, only with new tools. The medieval mind wrapped its fear in faith. The modern one wraps it in science. But both are whispers of the same truth. We are still terrified of the silence that follows the last breath. Listen carefully, and you'll hear it. The hum of refrigeration, the soft prayer of machinery preserving memory. In that sound lies the same yearning that once drove monks to boil the flesh from saints and soldiers alike. The same desire that led families to cradle bones, to light candles, to whisper through tears, "You are not gone. You are only waiting." And so the thread of history winds onward, unbroken, from boiling cauldrons to steel chambers, from relics to glass cases, from sacred altars to sterile laboratories. The ritual continues. It has only changed its name. If you were to walk through a medieval ossuary and then step into a modern museum, you would feel it instantly, that hush, that reverence, that fragile balance between awe and unease. The space between the living and the dead is still sacred, still trembling. Only now we have learned to call it education, or science, or heritage. But deep down, beneath the labels and the lighting, the same heartbeat echoes, slow, solemn, human. And perhaps, when the future looks back on us, they will see our own rituals, our coffins of steel, our digital memorials, our frozen bodies, as strange, even disgusting. They will whisper about us, the way we whisper about the Middle Ages. They will wonder how we could have believed such things, done such things, in the name of love, or faith, or hope. And then, perhaps, they will realize what we have just begun to understand, that disgust and devotion are often the same emotion, seen from different centuries. The Middle Ages did not vanish. They simply fell asleep beneath the dust of time. And if you listen long enough, if you slow your breath and let the world grow quiet, you can still hear them dreaming. And now, as the echoes of the Middle Ages grow faint, let the world of flickering torches and cold stone walls slowly dissolve into the dark. The monks have stopped chanting. The fires have gone out. Only the whisper of time remains. You have walked through centuries tonight, past cathedrals and crypts, past kings and commoners, past the strange and the sacred. You've seen the ways people once feared decay, and the tenderness hidden even within their most disturbing acts. Now, everything is still. The cauldrons are cold. The bones have long turned to dust. And yet, the love, the fear, the hope, all of it, lingers softly, woven into the quiet of history. As you lie here, listening, you can almost feel the rhythm of time slowing around you, each breath like a turning page, each heartbeat a fading echo of a story older than memory. The past is not gone. It only sleeps. Beneath your feet, beneath your dreams, deep in the gentle hush of the earth. So, close your eyes. Let the sounds of the present fade. Let your thoughts drift like candle smoke through vaulted halls of silence. The story has ended, but history continues to breathe slowly, softly, endlessly. Good night, traveler of time. Sleep well, and may the forgotten centuries keep you company in your dreams.